but you won't find it out there.
All right, well, good morning. Good looking group. I've talked about a pastor friend of mine who used to always say he'd sit on the front row like for the start of service because it was depressing because nobody was there at the start of service. But usually by the time I got up the stage, it kind of looked pretty good. So I sneak in the back room sometimes, and then I get this wow moment when I walk in. It's like, okay, wow, cool. There's back to people's heads. It's always good to see people. Well, here's one of the things I'm just unload on you right at the beginning. One of the things that bothers me, because I am such a caring person, and I'm often right, a lot, like it's a burden most of the time, really. So it bothers me when people do it wrong. You're like, do what wrong, Dennis? Like anything. I mean, most of you have been in situations, right, where you can see it coming. And it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. It's like, you watch the way this couple treats each other, and you just know, okay, this is not going to end well. This isn't going anywhere good. Or you watch the way somebody's raising their kids, and you just want to go, hey, you're raising them wrong. Let me tell you how to do it if you want good results, right? And you don't say that, but then a few years later, you're just kind of like, there's trouble, and you sort of saw it coming. And it's not like you have this crystal ball or anything like that, but sometimes you just see it coming, and because I'm so especially right about so many things that it's almost this burden, right? I mean, but silliness aside, it is tragic when you watch people like just undermine their own happiness. And there really is enough unavoidable pain in life already without us creating opportunities, unnecessary pain for ourselves. Isn't that true? And so we're all going to have trouble in this life. In fact, here's one of the promises Jesus made, and everybody knows it. He said, in this life, you will have trouble. And this isn't one of these verses. I doubt anybody in here has this one pinned to your desk, cubicle, or on your refrigerator at home. Nobody has this verse tattooed on their arm, right? But maybe we should, because you just know that. That's true. So with all the unavoidable trouble that's already out there, it really is tragic when we make decisions that destroy our own happiness. And I really don't know it all. And so I make a lot of these boneheaded mistakes too. So we're going to talk about that today. And oftentimes, the reason we undermine our own happiness is really the confusion around these two words, okay? Pleasure and happiness. Sometimes they're synonymous, but they're very, very different. And we're going to talk specifically about the relationship between these two words, pleasure and happiness. But to get there, okay, I just want to begin with something Jesus said, that if you grew up in church, you've heard this before. Jesus was teaching one day, but it was a time where apparently not everybody was really tracking with him as well as maybe they did other times. So it's like Jesus changes gears right in the middle of what he's teaching them, try to get their attention back. And here's what he said. He said, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. If you grew up in church, you've heard this before. And in fact, when we read this verse, church people, you usually would read the thief as who? Devil, right? Yeah, I mean, most of us, when we read this, that's who we think about, the devil. But actually, okay, when you go back, and I would encourage you to do this, kind of read this in context. When Jesus refers to the thief, he's actually referring to anybody that steps into someone else's life and as a result steals something or kills something or destroys something. So it could be the devil, it could be anybody though. And now here's the part, okay, here's the part you're not going to like. And you get used to hearing me say this sometimes, right? And this is going to be a little bit of a downer for a couple of minutes, but it gets really better, so hang with me here. But I want you to just think about this, okay? And don't answer this out loud. But who in your life would you say has the greatest potential to steal something from your future, or to kill a relationship, or to destroy something in your life? Who has the greatest potential? Who in your life has the most potential to take something away from you that you want? Like especially as it relates to where you want to go and your goals and your future. Destroy your life or kill a relationship. And the answer really is the same for all of us. It's the person I look at every morning in the mirror, right? Think about this. You have more potential to steal from you, to kill a relationship or destroy your life than anybody else. And we just have to wrestle with this. You, in some capacity, are potentially your own thief that Jesus was talking about here, okay? In fact, we have a real common way of saying this. You ever heard this? I'm my own worst enemy. That's what he was getting at. So here's the bad news, okay? This is true. You are sometimes your own worst enemy. You have done more to undermine your own happiness in your life than anybody else, and you have the capacity to do more to undermine your own happiness than anyone else. Okay, and here's how I know that, because you bought it, right? You leased it. You ate it, you drank it, you smoked it, right? You dated it, you might have slept with it, some of you even married it, right? You did all of that. So we do this to ourselves, okay? When you think about unhappiness, you were there for all that stuff, right? You are the common denominator for every decision, everything that ever happened in your life. And as much as we want to blame other people for our unhappiness, the truth is, I can't be my own worst enemy. And Jesus says the thief is the one that comes to steal your life, and it steals something, steals your future, kills something, kills potentially a relationship or a dream, and it destroys things. Yeah, and I'm oftentimes that person. And then he makes this bold statement, okay? He says, in contrast, though, I have come that they might have life. And okay, when Jesus says this, apparently he didn't get the response he wanted from the crowd. They're just kind of staring at him. So he adds this phrase to punctuate it. He said, and to have it to the full. And now the problem with this little English word full that we have, it doesn't really capture the weight, I think, and the full energy of the original Greek word. It's like one of those words we don't really have a good English word to really get to what he was saying here. In fact, like you may have grown up in church where, around the King James Bible version of this, and here's how you heard this verse, right? I've come that they might have life and have it more what? Somebody finish it. Abundantly, right? Yeah, we name churches after that. It's a great word, and I think it's actually a way better word than full, because abundantly, right? That captures some of that energy of what Jesus was talking about. I mean, in fact, if I can just geek out a little bit for a sec, when you actually look up this little Greek word, it's actually defined as this, okay? Pertaining to that which is not ordinarily encountered. Now, I don't know, to me, that's a really great definition. I think that's pretty awesome. It's I've come that you have life in a way that is beyond ordinary. Right? It's extraordinary. It's beyond the average life. That's what I've come to give you, a bigger story. He says, I've come that you might have life and have an extraordinary, abundant life, the kind of life like when people meet you, they go like, wow, okay, where did that come from? I want some of that. There's just something different. And what's different, it isn't that, okay, that you haven't had a hard time. You have. It isn't that you've always gotten everything you wanted, because you haven't. The difference is something that's sort of internal, but it's made its way out into the way that you live your life and the way you respond to life around you. So Jesus, that's what he's saying. Listen, I've come to give you that life, a life that is full, abundant, beyond the ordinary life, extraordinary. And then he makes this statement about himself. He goes on, he says, I am the good shepherd. Which doesn't mean a whole lot to us, because we don't have a lot of shepherds, and we're not around sheep for the most part, I don't think. We don't know a lot about sheep and shepherds. But in the first century, he says this, and they're kind of leaning in because this was their life. They understood this. Okay, now you're talking about something we understand. Go on. He says, I'm the good shepherd. Not just the average shepherd, right? Because I haven't come to give you an average life. No, in fact, he says, I'm the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now, okay, if you're new to church, or maybe you're coming back to church, or you had a bad church experience somewhere in the past, this is really important for you to know when you think about what Jesus is saying here, okay? No matter what you read in the Old Testament, no matter what you read in the New Testament, whatever you read that might seem kind of confusing to you, or you're just kind of like, I don't know about that yet, you just need to understand that the entire context for everything else that you read is that God sent his son into the world to be a good shepherd. Jesus is the filter for everything else, he said. And Jesus says a good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. That's core. And listen, okay, this is what you need to understand. If someone is willing to give their life for you, and Jesus did, he is for you. He is not against you. He's for you. And this stands in sharp contrast to what he said the thief does. The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd. I've come to build. I've come to protect. I've come to give you something bigger. And so you have a decision to make, okay? Are you going to follow the sheep, or the thief, or are you willing, and am I willing to decide that Jesus really is the good shepherd, that I really do believe he has my best interest at heart, that I can trust him with a bigger story, and so I'm going to follow him. I'm going to take steps to be like him, this shepherd who is for me. Now there's another problem with this, though, is that, okay, when in this passage, Jesus compares us to sheep. And I don't know if anybody been around sheep very much. I mean, I've only seen them at like petting zoos and stuff. Sheep are not all that smart. At least that's what they say, right? And so, in fact, some people would say sheep are dumb. We call people sheep as a derogatory term, right? You're just a sheep. And so this is offensive. But you shouldn't be offended, okay? Here's why. Because as we said earlier, right, you bought it, you ate it, you leased it, you smoked it, right? You dated it, and you're glad that I don't keep going on with this list because of all the dumb things that you did in your life, right? So Jesus knows what he's talking about. You oftentimes are your own worst enemy. I am my own worst enemy a lot of the times. And Jesus says, all I'm saying is this, okay? I'm the good shepherd, and as offensive as it might be to think of yourself as a sheep, I'm asking you to follow me. I'm asking you to trust me. And so far, I don't think I've really said anything that you don't already know about yourself. I don't think anybody's going like, wow, okay, that's unbelievable. Undermine mine. What? No, right? I had no idea. No, your mind's already probably going to all the regrets and all the times that you've lived this out in your life, right? You're glad you're not in, like, this isn't life group where we're going around the circle and sharing, and because we could just talk about all the stupid sheep-like things we've done. Because we're wandering around most of the time in life like a herd of unguided sheep. But why is that? Okay, why is it we say the dumb things we say and regret the things we do over and over and over and over again like a bunch of sheep? Well, part of it, okay, and this is why we took the long way to kind of sneak up on this topic. A big part of it goes back to the confusion we have about these two words, pleasure and happiness. And if you've been in church your whole life, okay, you may have never heard anybody say this. And you might not even believe it, and you might want to argue with me about it, and it's okay if you want to argue in your mind and wrestle with it later. But did you know that God created you with the ability to experience both of these? It's not an either or. God wants you to experience some pleasure and happiness. And I know in our culture, some of y'all hear pleasure, and it automatically goes to like sexual pleasure or something. Okay, but even think about that. God is the one who created sexual pleasure. He's not even good. God made that up just toward the ends of creation, right? He was just like, hey, you know what would really be awesome? It's like the angels are like, what? And he's like, you wouldn't understand. But, it gets us in a lot of trouble, that kind of pleasure, right? And we abuse it, and we take it outside the guardrails. But in some kind of even cosmic way, God created sexual pleasure and all kinds of pleasure. I mean, think about this. If you go back and look at the very first miracle Jesus performed, it got him in a lot of hot water, made a reputation for him with some people as well. The very first miracle he did was creating wine at a wedding, right? It's like, okay, we're going to get this thing started right now. Should we heal somebody? He's like, nah, right? Let's make some wine. Are you sure you want to start with that one? Yeah, because we'll cause some controversy for all the Baptists in the future, right? This will be fun. The point being, okay, God created all of that. God created the capacity for pleasure, and we can abuse it. But just like God created the capacity for pleasure, he also wants us to experience happiness. It's not an either or. The question is really priority. Okay, and when we start to prioritize pleasure over real happiness, that's when there's a problem. In fact, okay, when you start to prioritize pleasure over happiness, ultimately you get neither. Think about how this plays out in your life. Because one will lead to the other, but the other ultimately undermines the one. Pleasure undermines your happiness. Happiness can and will ultimately lead to happiness or to pleasure. In fact, I believe happiness leads to ultimate pleasure. But if you pursue pleasure as the priority, and you ignore all the principles that lead to real happiness, at the end of the day, you're going to have neither, because eventually, okay, and you know this, eventually pleasure loses its pleasure. It kind of becomes routine. It doesn't do it for me anymore. And eventually can even become a prison. It's what we call this, okay, the law of diminishing returns. You ever heard of this before? Like, you used to take pleasure in half a glass, but then it was a full glass, and then it was 2 glasses, and then 3, and then 4, and And now you're yelling at people and you don't even remember what happened the night before, right? Like, what happened? Well, over time, every legitimate pleasure, okay, if it becomes a master, if it becomes a priority, every legitimate pleasure loses its pleasure. You know, what begins as a pastime becomes like a pathway, and it becomes a habit, and it might even become an addiction, and it oftentimes becomes this prison. And these aren't things that are just illegal and immoral. These aren't just things that anybody would even consider wrong sometimes. But in your life, okay, in my life, when we prioritize pleasure over principles of true happiness, as the kind of things we've been talking about these last few weeks, okay, at the end of the day, pleasure loses its pleasure. And so the Apostle Paul, okay, he wrote just like 25 or 30 years after Jesus, not very long at all. After the resurrection, he takes the teachings of Jesus, and Paul's job was kind of to explain this to the non-Jewish people, Gentiles. And so he writes to these Christians in Rome about this and kind of teases this idea out a little bit. And I want you to listen to how he says this. I love how Paul would explain this kind of stuff in his deep but kind of real down-to-earth way. He says this, "Don't you know?" And it's like he starts out almost kind of like snarky, just kind of like, you should have been common sense. Like, where have you been? Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you're slaves to the one you obey? And he's saying something like you already know. He's just going to say it in a way you haven't heard it before. So he says this. But let's be honest, okay, when you read this verse, you first read it, you go, I don't even know what he's talking about, right? Because, okay, either that's one of those duh kind of statements that doesn't make any sense. Like, okay, when I give myself to be a slave, I'm their slave. Okay, where are you going with that? Or it's like it's so deep that I just don't get it. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure. What does that even mean, Paul? So let's just read it again, okay? He says, don't you know? Now think about this. Don't just think about theology. Don't think about Bible doctrine. I want you to just think about common sense. Don't you know that he says when you offer yourself, when you make choices, which we all do, right? I'll take one of those, right? I'll do that. Yes. Don't you know when you offer yourself to someone or something as obedient servants, as slaves, you are slaves to the one you obey? In other words, he says, okay, if you continue to say yes to this, you continue to make those choices over and over and over again, don't you realize that you are becoming a slave to pleasure? And that's not pleasurable. You go, I'm not a slave. No, I'm choosing. It's my choice. I'm in control. He's going, yeah, exactly. See, that's my point. Don't you know that if you keep choosing the same thing over and over and over and over again, you're no longer really choosing. At some point, you're just kind of being drawn in. You're giving up control, and you're behaving like a servant, like a slave. You're behaving as if, you have to now. This isn't a want to anymore. It's an urge. You're acting on impulse. And then he goes on, he says this, whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. Okay, we talked about this word a few weeks ago, sin. Sin always leads to death of something, whatever your definition of sin is. Right? It always leads to death. Sin always kills stuff. It kills relationships. It kills your view of yourself. It'll kill your marriage. It'll kill, your relationship with your employees, your employer. Sin always kills stuff. Wherever there's sin, there's death. So he says, all right, you can either offer yourself to be slaves to sin, which leads to death, or there's an alternative. And now he's leaning back into what Jesus was saying. He says, or you can offer yourselves to a bigger story, to obedience, to God through Christ, which leads to righteousness. And righteousness is like this big fancy word that just means like rightness, a right relationship with God, an integrity that I know about myself. You can choose that, a bigger story you were created for. And Paul says, look, don't you realize that every single day of your life, you're making choices, you're offering yourself to something, you're a servant or you're a slave to, you're offering yourself through obedience to something or someone. And he says, when you do that, okay, when you obey, when you give in, when you say yes over and over and over, you're giving up your freedom. And you're acting like a servant. You're acting like a slave. And he says you can either do that to pleasure, you can do that to sin, or you can lean into and give yourself in obedience to the bigger story your Creator, your Heavenly Father, has for your life. You do have choice. Now, Jesus' way of saying this was, again, okay, you can follow me, you can trust me because I'm a good shepherd. And Paul would say, hey, don't you know that anything or anybody you continue to say yes to over and over again, don't you know you're becoming a slave to that person or that thing? That pleasure takes precedence over the principles of happiness, and so ultimately you don't have either. Jesus talked in other places about this like sowing and reaping, and we talked about this too because we get in trouble. This is where we get in trouble when we get unhappy, and when we're feeling unhappy, we immediately want to do something that makes us feel better, right? I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's human nature, but this is what gets us in trouble, right? I'm unhappy, so I'm going to go shopping. Get on the internet and buy me something because I like box showing up at my door, right? I'm unhappy, so I'm going to stop by the bar. And I'll just have one or a few, right? I'm unhappy, so, I'm going to call so-and-so because I know they have some whatever. I'm unhappy, so I'm going to call her. I'm going to get an app, and I'm just going to start swiping, right? I'm unhappy, and I need something to kind of pick me up. I need a quick fix. I'm unhappy, so I'll just escape to my computer for a few minutes, which becomes a few hours maybe, right? That's when we make these choices, these decisions that, yeah, I'm in control of, but they ultimately undermine our own happiness. And here's Jesus' message to all of us who are unhappy. He says there's no quick fix to happiness. It's sowing and reaping. You sow and you reap your way there. Happiness is not just immediately accessible. We've said this every week. You don't just walk out of here and make a decision to be happy. You start making decisions that lead to happiness. But as long as you're saying yes to pleasure, quick fix, over and over and over and over again, to somehow be, that's your source or for your lack of happiness, ultimately you're going to undermine happiness because you become a slave, you become a servant to the thing you obey, you give your choices to. And so Jesus says, sow better, reap better, right? You grow what you feed. And not immediately, not this afternoon, not tomorrow about 5 o'clock maybe, but ultimately you will feel better. You will be happier. But if your response to unhappiness is, okay, I got to do something right now to feel better, ultimately you're undermining that, and you already know that, don't you? Because every single one of us in this room, including me, we know the thing we go to. We know what our go-to is when we need that quick fix, when we're not feeling happy. And it's just every time I give in to that urge, every time I give in to that choice, Paul says you're acting like a slave or a servant to something that ultimately undermines your own happiness. This is why you hear us say from time to time around here that following Jesus will make your life better, and following Jesus will make you better at life. Following Jesus, who says, okay, I'm the good shepherd. You can trust me. Follow me. Following Jesus will make your life better, and ultimately following Jesus will make you better at life. But it's not instant, right? It's not this quick fix. It's sowing and sowing and sowing and sowing and growing and feeding and growing and feeding and ultimately reaping. Grow what you feed. And so I'm going to ask you a question. We're going to wrap this up for today. And it's a hard question, okay? And when I ask this question, here's what I'm asking you to do. First of all, don't argue with me, okay? I'm gonna ask you a question, but listen, nobody can read your mind. This is just for you to think about. There's no point in not being honest with yourself when I ask you this question, okay? And this isn't going to be a trick question. This isn't going to be like one of those, okay, well, if your answer is this, then I want you to raise your hand with nobody looking around, right? Because everybody looks around. I see you up here. We're not going to do that with this question. So I just want you to be honest. I want you, whether you're religious at all or maybe you're like me, maybe you were just kind of born into church, right? I just want you to answer this question for you, nobody else, because you owe it to yourself to know and admit this to yourself, okay? Because remember, only a thief is going to try to steal your future from you. Only a thief is going to try to kill your relationships and try to destroy you. So why not, when I ask you this question, just try to acknowledge what's really brutally true about you today, okay? Only a thief would not want you to answer this question honestly. All right, so you ready? I kind of built that up. Here's the question, okay? Is there a pleasure that's wrecking your happiness? Is there an urge? Is there a yes you keep saying over and over and over to something that is undermining your real happiness in life? Is there a pleasure? It might not even be a sin. Might be a sin, maybe not. But is there a pleasure? Maybe it's not immoral, it's not illegal, although it might be. Might be sort of illegal, but nobody cares, whatever. Is there a pleasure that's beginning to destroy your happiness? In other words, okay, if you were really honest, and you don't want to admit it, and I know you don't want to admit it, because if you admit it, that means I got to own it, and I got to do something about it, right? Let me let you off the hook with that too, okay? You don't have to do anything about it right now. I just want you right now to be honest with yourself. Is there a pleasure? Is there an it that you have said yes to so many times that it is beginning to wreck your real happiness? Is there a pleasure that if you continue to say yes to this thing, it's going to wreck the happiness of people that you care about the most, and you know it? Is there a pleasure that, it's just kind of slowly, it's that thing your girlfriend looks at you every time and she can tell you can tell she wants to say something, but she knows better than to say something, because the last time she said something, it turned into, right? Or your wife or your husband, they say something. Is there a pleasure? All right, now come on, this is just you in your mind. Is there a pleasure that's begun to wreck your happiness? And if you continue to say yes to that pleasure, you're a thief to yourself. And you're rejecting Jesus' invitation to trust me, to follow me. I've got something much better for you, but you're going to have to trust me. I'm the good shepherd. You're going to have to trust me with this bigger story. And so you know the answer to that question. And you don't have to answer it for anybody but yourself. But here's what I want you to know, okay, as if you need me to tell you this. One day you're going to wish you had quit answering the door to whatever that is. One day you're going to look back and you're going to wonder, why am I so unhappy? And you'll discover in that moment that you are in fact a sheep who needs a shepherd. But perhaps by God's grace today, you'd be willing to trade your pleasure for the good shepherd before you have to live this out. As a good shepherd, he's not going to drain you of life. It's the exact opposite. He's a good shepherd who's coming into this world to provide you and to give you an extraordinary life, a bigger story. And now for most of us, to do anything with what we just answered in our mind about, what we just talked about, for a lot of us, this could require some extreme measures. Like your happiness might require some extreme measures. We're not nearly as good at cutting back on stuff as we are at just cutting some things out. And that might be something you need to do, whatever that is. For most of us, cutting back never works. So you've tried that, you've promised that, and you're sitting here today still struggling with the same thing. Listen, your happiness is at stake, and you want to be happy, and the moment you quit prioritizing the pleasure over your happiness will be a good day. Not just for you, but for everyone that loves you, everybody that cares about you, everybody that's dependent on you. This is what Jesus says to you. I want you to follow me. I want you to trust me. I'm the good shepherd. I want you to quit being the thief in your own life. Let me just pray for you. God, I just pray that as we wrestle with this today, that you give us the wisdom to know what to do with what we've just heard. It's so heavy, and this is the kind of thing that's so much easier just to stand up here and talk about than it is for me to walk off this stage and go do it myself. For many of us, this is a daily struggle, and yet we know Paul is exactly right. So would you just give us your wisdom to know what to do with what we've just heard? Give us the courage to actually go out of here and take the steps to begin to do it, and make us happier in what we grow and trust you with. In Jesus' name, amen.